which is exciting. There we go. Excellent. Okay. So the first thing that I wanted to do actually is I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I'm going to pull up our oh, for goodness sakes, there we go. I had it all set up, guys. So we do on an annual basis this month, and it's sort of interactive report that you can scroll through, and it's not of what GFAN is. Lovely pictures of the team and sort of some of the work that we've done and some of the structure that we have as GFAN. So I'm just going through these really quick, but we'll pop the link to it into our chat, because I did want to get to some of the work that some of these kinds of slides, which sort of show some of the work that we did around preparing for the replenishment issue briefs that we did. This is a listing of them. Some of the work that we had done around pandemic preparedness and continuing our work around ACT Day, as well as a revamped website that hopefully is a little bit easier to navigate. Reports from both of the board meetings and debrief calls last year. So if you're newer or thinking about engaging in the upcoming board meeting and advocacy, those may be a good place to start to have a sense of what's taken place most recently at the Global Fund board meetings. We also, continue to have these calls, and we had a number of in-person activities after a long time of doing most of our work virtually. And we're pleased to welcome as many of you as we could in my home country, in Canada. We know there were some serious issues around visas, and I hope that the recent decision from the IAF to have a plan out there in terms of where they are going to be holding the conference in different regions is at least a starting point to making the conference more accessible and less challenging for others. So we joined our GFAN regional partners and hosted 2 different spaces that many of you who were able to attend in person took advantage of. And we also, of course, were present in New York City and trying to provide spaces to those of you who were there and those of you who were working virtually to participate in the conversations around the pledging meeting itself, which was maybe a little bit more exciting and a little bit more unknown than some previous recent ones anyways, where many of the pledges were already known ahead of the replenishment conference. We continue to do our work around pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, and that's something we're still looking into as a group. And our speakers bureau, which we are currently reconstituting, and we should be able to welcome about 10 to 12 new speakers in the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. And despite us trying not to actually increase our size, we increased our number of members by over 200 individual members, representing more than close to 650 organizations in 105 countries. And so I guess maybe the word gets out there that this is a useful group and a useful community to be a part of. And so we're delighted to welcome new members all the time who find the work that we do useful. And we also send out an annual survey, which more of you than ever filled out in 2022, which we are, really grateful for. And we presented just a few of the key sort of facts here in terms of what was useful. And what I wanted to do, so there's more to this and it just keeps going, but you can see it online yourself. And I think, have we shared the link to that? We will get that in there. But what I wanted to do was bring us back to essentially the conversation that we had at the beginning of this year in our first call and talk a little bit about what is needed going forward. So you have the opportunity through the annual survey to express what it is that you find useful, but not everybody is able to do that. And because unfortunately, we had a bit of a miscommunication with a colleague who was going to join and talk about a specific issues and tools around World TB Day, but unfortunately we got confused around dates. And so I learned earlier today that they would not be able to join us. I thought it would be helpful to go back to spend a little bit more time and more time for discussion about what it is that we can do to support your advocacy. And so to try and sort of start that conversation off, I'm just sharing with you a few slides here that we've shared in a few different contexts with our steering committee, but also back in our first call this year, this is what we said. What are we going to do now? How do we do this? And so part of what we've been doing for the last month and since the replenishment is trying to gather information about how additional resources could be raised or why they might need to be raised and what some of the impact of not meeting that $18 billion target is. So while I would not say that we actually have the answers yet, this slide just shows you, sort of how the core ask that we had around the 3 diseases stacks up to what's actually available for allocation, which are those 2 outside bars, or I guess they're called bars, in terms of 24 that we asked for and the 12.9 that was actually available for allocation. And then also in terms of mobilizing resources, I think that for many people, the catalytic initiative is a space where we have a lot of concern with it being less than half of what it was in the previous cycle. And so as things like allocation letters have come out and the allocation and eligibility formula was run, we're seeing that, for example, and I really have to thank colleagues from the CRG platforms who also have done some of this analysis that I'm borrowing, matching funds in particular, you can see in human rights, key populations, adolescent girls and young women, they are all decreasing by significant percentages. There is one new matching fund for effective community systems and responses with 8 countries in Africa eligible. So the picture is not totally horrible, but it is shocking. And the impact is going to be felt in a number of places. For example, with adolescent girls and young women, I believe it's something like 7 of the 13 countries that were eligible in the last cycle are not even eligible for any matching funds in this cycle. Multi-country grants, we know, will be a little bit less, but the full picture around that's not quite known yet because there's still some work to do based on the decision that was made at the board meeting in November that isn't part of the allocation formula or the allocation letters, which is the only data we have at this stage. And we do know that things like the strategic initiatives have decreased from 20 to 8 in total. So you can see that these are just sort of some of the questions that we're asking ourselves, and we want to talk to our members in different spaces and places over the next few months in terms of where are the needs for more resources needed most. We can see this, we can see the impact on the catalytic initiative in terms of eligibility and how much has been allocated, but how is this going to play out in terms of those country conversations through CCMs and GC and the cycle 7 applications as they're being developed and submitted? And what appetite do we all have for ongoing resource mobilization? And the Secretariat itself, what are their plans? And what is the new mechanism for receiving new funds? It's a bit of a technical question, but one that have already started talking about a little bit with colleagues from one of the delegations to the Global Fund Board that I belong to, the Developed Country and Geo delegation. So I just wanted, this isn't a fully structured conversation. But I just wanted to share with you that as we had started, at the beginning of the year that we had these questions, we still have these questions, but we're starting to gather some of the answers, including understanding better the impacts on the catalytic initiative. I had a lovely conversation with colleagues from the US to understand a little bit better about how we make sure that we leverage the US pledge to its fullest and what could be some possibilities there. And so I just wanted to open it up. I see that Chris, who I think had to jump off, wanted to float an idea about actions around global health and the climate financing agenda, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And so I would just like to open it up. And I just want to be able to have a conversation about, is any of this data shocking to you? What are some of the things that we can do to make sure that we are continuing to advocate for resources and for an effective global fund? So Chris, not to put you on the spot, but if you're still there, so if you have a minute to jump in with that idea, that would be helpful. And if some of these questions and information that I've shared prompts more ideas from you, please be welcome to share them as well.
Hi, Thanks, Katie, and thanks everybody. Yeah, I just kind of woke up and thought about this morning, but obviously we've got a financing crisis here. I mean, we've been underinvesting in ending AIDS, TB, and malaria. We've been underinvesting in pandemic preparedness. We're nowhere near raising the funds for UHC. So we need to turn this around, and climate advocates, including the Prime Minister of Barbados, are showing real leadership on climate and finance and pressing for new ways to unlock money in financial institutions. I mean, obviously, we have to grow overseas development assistance, there's no question, but we also have to unlock billions more money to get to the health targets that we want. I mean, you've seen from the pandemic fund, it's grossly underfunded, but we also, though we did really well at Global Fund replenishment, we fell short of the need there. So we need to turn this around. There's a financing discussion happening that's focusing on climate. Global health has got to be part of it. And I think GFAN could play a role in rabble-rousing ahead of the World Bank spring meetings to insist that global health has to be on that agenda. The interconnections between climate and global health are one of the entry points for us, I think. But in its own right, I mean, the current financial system of the world is not serving our preparedness goals or responding to current epidemics. So I think maybe we could make some noise on this. That's my idea.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it. And I see Christoph with his hand raised. And I was just thinking, I was glad he joined the call today, because I know Christoph has spent actually considerable time and effort in this particular area. So I was going to call on him. So Christoph, I'm going to call on you first. And then I do see that there's Robin, you have your hand raised, and we'll come back to you. So Christoph, please jump in.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Chris, for that suggestion. Great to join you all today. Just wanted to point out that there are two people who are, very close to our GFAN network, who are engaged very much on the kind of Bridgetown agenda and the upcoming Macron-Motley summit in Paris. One is Jamie Drummond, long-term colleague from One, who has been very much engaged, in this discussion, and the other is another very long-term advocate and member of GFAN, Khalil Ilouagidi, whom most of you will remember from Coalition Plus. Khalil is now the director for global public investment, working for Equal International, and he was here last week and had a meeting then in Paris on Friday with people who are working on the Macron-Motley summit. There are 4 different working groups, and one is kind of the one that where you can bring up these issues. The others are dealing with, debt crisis, SDR, and others. But the working group 4 is where you potentially can bring in such topic. So would be great to reach out to Khalil and get his insights there. I trust that he will try to get a follow-up meeting with the French government on that. It's all quite challenging, as we know. This agenda for the summit in Paris is very tightly controlled. There's a lot of kind of debate also within the French government whether they should make it ambitious or not. Not everybody is excited about making it too ambitious because they think they are afraid they cannot deliver. But certainly, Jamie and Khalil, I think, are 2 colleagues that would be good to talk to on this and see what might be possible. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Christoph. I know I remember back in 2019, when there was the UHC high-level meeting, there were some conversations that you convened around sort of these topics around the intersections and working together between colleagues in climate and health. So those are 2 good reminders of colleagues that are in some of these conversations and moving some of this forward. But always useful to hear your reflections, and if there's others that we could reach out to. So I'm going to go to Robin Waite next. And your comments, whether they're related to what we've just been talking to or not, but helpful to hear from others whether this intersection of climate and health is a useful area. And in particular, does the suggestion that Chris said he woke up with this morning around advocating around the World Bank meetings and doing a bit of rabble rousing make sense to others? So Robin, over to you.
Sure, my comment's not related to that, but I will say that I think that makes great sense. So totally second and on board with those ideas from Chris. I wanted to come back to what happened with the catalytic initiative. And if you could maybe explain the context of what happened there, I think that could be helpful from a resource mobilization perspective for people who are maybe engaging their colleagues at government levels. So I recall you saying something along the lines of it being like quite a significant boo-boo moment of realization. So if you can explain that context, I just think it could be helpful for resource mobilization efforts.
So yeah, I think that was in a conversation that you and I were having, Robin. And I think, so the process at the board level in terms of the decision making around how the funds that are raised during a replenishment are utilized start, about a year before, if not a little bit, prior to that even, because they need to line up a number of decisions that have to have, conversations in committees and then at the board table that identify how, whether the allocation and eligibility formulas are going to change in any way. So they have those conversations, not with every replenishment, but, it has to be sort of rediscussed, I guess, and reconfirmed. And they also have a discussion around the catalytic initiative and what would be prioritized at different levels of funding. This replenishment, I think people were very optimistic in terms of being able to raise significant amounts of funding, of additional funding, at least when we were thinking about making decisions around, or the board was thinking, I should say, I'm not actually a voting member of the board, but when the board was making those decisions and having those discussions, I think people were very optimistic. And the baseline for starting the sort of scenarios of the catalytic funding, because when they put that up for decision, they put a number of categories where if X amount is raised and available for allocation, this is what will be funded in the catalytic funding. If a higher amount is raised, then this is what will be funded, and it adds in additional items and or additional money into those things that were funded in the first scenario. And if I remember correctly, there was 4 or 5 sort of levels of how much funding would then indicate what the level of the catalytic initiative would be. And what happened in that decision is my memory of it, and I would welcome any others to jump in who were a part of those discussions. My memory is most people who had concerns around the catalytic initiative around the board table were mostly concerned about capping it so it didn't get too big, which I don't think was something that our civil society and communities delegations were as concerned with, because I think broadly speaking supported the catalytic initiative and the work that it accomplishes. But I think there was a decision to cap it no matter the level of resources that were mobilized at 1.1 billion. But what happened in that decision also, which is what I think was a bit unintended in terms of what the consequences are, is that they moved the starting point of how much would be funded up to a much higher level of mobilized resources. Because if you would go back to the same set of decisions and the same framing of the catalytic initiative in the previous cycle, we would have a $900 million catalytic initiative again, this time, if we had kept the baseline the same. And so that's what I think, that's how I believe it's a bit of a kind of a boo-boo. Like, I think people were very optimistic around the board table about how much was going to be raised. And so some of this, so when a lot of this was being discussed in November's board meeting, and again, you can find our report and our sort of understanding of that as an observer to the board on our website. But as those discussions were taking place, there was an awful lot of concern, not regret per se, but a lot of concern that this is where we had ended up, because an awful lot of donors and an awful lot of colleagues around, around the board table, including, colleagues from Stop TB and from other places, were really hoping to see quite a big sort of jump in this and to see it actually cut back by more, it's now 400 million and it was 890, I believe, in the previous cycle, if I'm remembering my numbers right, was, really difficult in terms of the conversations in November. So there's a lot more sort of graphs and, documents that we can share out that we've shared in previous parts, but again, are in that report that we would have done in November or early December. from that board meeting, but hopefully that's helpful, Robin. And from my perspective, I believe that there's some room for conversation around how to get more funding into either into the initiatives that are funded in the Catalytic Initiative or something or similar. It's just there's no formal mechanism for that at the moment. And so it's a bit challenging when there's a bit of a technical barrier, but also whether or not you could raise more funding to sort of, fully fund the Catalytic Initiative. But this is what we're trying to get answers to and try to have these kinds of conversations with our members in this context today, but also in other contexts, so that we can better understand this and better understand what people's, advice or desires are in terms of continued advocacy. Great. Sorry, I'm struggling to move between things. So I am seeing Robin Montgomery, who with her hand raised, but who's appearing here via somebody else's Zoom account today. So Trevor, Robin, please go ahead.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everybody. It's Robin here. I'm moonlighting as a very good friend of mine, Trevor Stratton. So apologies. Trevor's a great guy. So I agree with everything that Katie has just said. And I don't know if it's helpful or not, but to add an additional layer of complexity, given the fact that we weren't able to raise the 18 billion, it had a detrimental impact on country allocations because of the cost of inflation, as well as exchange rates conversions. And so, as Katie described, there were a series of scenarios that were presented at the strategy committee and also at the board table. And a number of trade-offs were presented in terms of, do we go for lower country envelopes or lower country allocations in order to offset it with higher levels of catalytic investments? Or do we try to find, even a very small percentage increase in country envelopes that would allow for then to kind of offset in-country inflation on service delivery and ensure that there's continuity of services. And so it was really a very difficult discussion at the board table. And we all knew what was at stake in terms of the catalytic funding. And so, in the end, we all agreed that the continuity of services in addressing the higher cost of living and inflation within these very fragile economies was the priority. And then hoping for additional fundraising to happen across this current allocation cycle. So yeah, really difficult decisions at the board table. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. I mean, I think it's, I think there's some people here on the call today who probably participate in board meetings or have in the past and kind of understand, but there's an awful lot who don't have that opportunity. And so, we do try to do those debriefs and board meeting reports so that people can understand these kinds of complexities that happen at the board, sort of level of conversation. Because while none of us really, I think, wants to get totally into the weeds of all of this, it is important in terms of our advocacy to understand, the possible, the challenging, and the impossible in terms of, how things are set up. So thank you. That's really helpful to you and Robin for your question, and Christoph and Chris earlier for some of their sort of thoughts. Any other sort of questions or thoughts? Again, we can ask more questions, we can have more conversations around this, but also, the direction that we're going in terms of these, questions that we're trying to answer. Do these look like the right kinds of things that you'd like to see more information, more conversation, maybe some briefs around for you all in terms of your advocacy? Or are there other sort of aspects of potentially, working to mobilize resources that are important to you that, you don't think or you're not sure would necessarily be reflected in what we've shared today? feel free to unmute if you've got something you'd like to add in there. I just want to make sure that we're asking the right questions of ourselves and finding the right information that's going to be useful to you all in your advocacy. Okay. Okay, that's fine. Not seeing anybody unmuting or anybody with their hand raised, that is fine. So I believe that we are going to probably, oh, look at that blank slide, my friends. Okay, so we were also hoping to have colleagues from the GFAN regional partners meeting that's actually just wrapping up day 1 today, but I know that they were running late and had hoped to join the call, but I don't believe anybody, unless I am mistaken, anybody is here from that meeting to speak to what those conversations are. No. Okay. As usual, when you have face-to-face meetings, things are always a bit delayed. I joined them earlier today, but about a half an hour later than planned because of the agenda. So I would just open it up to anybody if they had other announcements or information to share. What I will say is you can probably expect to see more information clearly communicated about these calls when our colleague Conte is back next week. Thank goodness. We are looking towards the March 8th call to have a conversation around the 3 high-level meetings that are taking place this year. So you've seen a lot from us for obvious reasons as we're hosting the EBHLM Civil Society and Communities Coordination Hub, but there's also the UHC and PPR HLMs in theory all taking place this fall in September, as well as the likelihood that the pre-meeting for those HLMs will sort of happen all together somehow in either late April or early May. At least that was the last that I had heard. So that's what we're hoping to focus our conversations are on the next GFAN call, and also probably bring in some of the World TB Day content that we had hoped to provide you with today. But there was some miscommunication, so apologies for that, everyone. If there's any other announcements or information to share from you colleagues, please feel free to unmute and jump in. I see one hand raised from Robin. Wait, so I'll go to Robin. And if there's anything else, please do speak up after, and otherwise we will let you go early today. Robin?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Katie. Just to flag that the next coordination hub calls for affected community and civil society advocates engaging around the HLM are also scheduled already. So I'll flip the link to our landing page in the chat so you can go ahead and register for your preferred call. We're always going to have a call that's preferable around this time for colleagues that are in this side of the world, and then also one way later in my evening that's better for Asia Pacific and PNG. So choose the call that suits you best. And we just launched the other week a advocate's guide to the HLM that's also live on our landing page now. So check it out, make use of it. We hope that it's helpful. And lastly, there's a survey still open. We're going to be closing it soon, where we want to hear from all of you who will be engaging in the HLM process about what your experiences last year were, what you're planning on doing this year, and what your needs from an advocate mobilization perspective might be, so we can support you as best as possible. So I'll flip the link to the landing page in the chat, and please register and engage with all that materials.
Thanks, Robin. That's really helpful. And lots of great work happening there in the hub. Thanks to you and Priyanka. Christoph had posted sort of a comment about how there are, because of the way the replenishment cycles operate, sometimes there are countries that we expect to pledge, but that have not yet pledged, and noting that China is still expected to pledge, and that if anybody does know about any other potential countries that maybe have not yet fully pledged in their terms, it would be helpful to know that. So would welcome on that. I do know that colleagues in the UK are hoping to continue to pressure their government to make sure that they're not letting up on that aspect in terms of trying to bring that pledge up, but it likely requires a change in government before anything like that would even be really a conversation. So thanks to Robin for posting those links there. And Ross, you're asking about the UAE. I don't have any information, but I am, I have been told, I have heard that there are conversations going on with many of those countries in an ongoing way. Does anybody else have anything On the UAE, I don't see any hand raised. Peter Owiti, is that related to this?
No, it's related to what has been posted there, that about countries that are yet to pledge. That one is also thought of asking about some countries also pledge, mostly in low-income countries, but they don't commit to those pledges. The money is not received. So should we expect that whatever we had, the 14 billion, would in actual sense, in real terms, be a little bit much lower than what was the total pledge?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for sure, pledge conversion, I think, which is what they call in terms of making sure they get all the money from the pledges. Sorry, learned too many acronyms and technical terms here over the years, my friends. But that pledge conversion is something that in many countries, it's important to keep an eye on that. And I would suggest in terms of some of the low and middle income countries that did make pledges, in my opinion, that's a regional conversation to have in terms of how much advocacy you might want to do in terms of pushing for that pledge conversion, especially in the context that many countries, see themselves at the moment in terms of fiscal space restraints, because I think there's a lot of different opinions about whether or not those pledges are. We know the value of those pledges in terms of that global solidarity, but I think there are some differences of opinion and approach in terms of whether or not those pledges need to be fully converted to have the impact that they need to. But certainly it's something to watch, and I think again have conversations with regional colleagues to see whether there's sort of a common approach or maybe even a few, target countries around that. But generally speaking, it's usually the larger pledges that are critical to make sure that they convert at the full amounts that was pledged, as well as, just noting that the Secretariat does, and I'm sure there's Beatrice or Christoph who could be more technical about this, but there is there is some hedging, there are approaches to make sure that the Secretariat can balance out in terms of if some funds don't come in, right? Obviously they can't make up for huge amounts, but for some of the, smaller solidarity pledges, I think that there's some sort of hedging and some ways that they manage that risk already accounted for within the allocations. But I think noting from sort of these questions, I think it would be useful for us, as a part of these conversations, as we're figuring out what next in resource mobilization, is to get a better sense from colleagues at the Secretariat in terms of countries where they are continuing to focus on, where there are possible expected pledges, and to see what we can do as advocates, globally and or regionally or within those countries to support that. So I think they're getting ready to do that soon. I know we'd originally hoped to have the Secretariat on at the end of January, and I think that the review work and the understanding the path forward is taking maybe a little bit more time than they might have hoped at the end of last year. But we are hoping that we will see them on a call to do much of that in the next few weeks. Are there any other comments or questions, or somebody want to jump in and correct anything that I have gotten wrong or oversimplified? I'm sure I oversimplified it, but I mean, if there's something else that needs to be hopped in. Christoph, I think I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I just put that into the chat, Katie, but to Peter's point, and you already expressed that of course, pledge conversion is now the high priority for the Secretariat and should be for GFAN as well. But the Secretariat always takes into account that not all countries will fully convert, and there is a discounting mechanism that they apply before they decide on the amount available for allocation. So that has happened before the last board meeting. You sometimes can get it wrong, but that's a kind of trusted methodology that they always apply after replenishment. And usually, they can predict pretty well the amount that actually will be paid in. Thanks.
Yeah, and we've thank you for that. Thank you for providing a bit more detail. We've certainly indicated to the Secretariat that we hope to have more open conversations around pledge conversions, and when they're seeing challenges in specific places, that they make sure that we, can work together to reduce those risks and or to advocate strongly that, pledges are not reduced and that kind of thing. So I think we have a sense, some of the bigger countries like France and Japan who have, reiterated that, their pledges are up to certain amounts and tend to be the process of getting those funds allocated every year and those pledges converted is always a little bit more, it seems to be more complicated. It's similar to the US in terms of the process. And so we already know some of those places that we need to keep an eye on, but there may be others. And, we want to talk to the Secretariat about making sure that, as advocates, that they're giving us as much of a heads up as possible and sharing as much information as possible so that we can support that sort of pledge conversion advocacy if it's needed. Any other sort of comments or questions at this stage? Okay. Again, apologies for the sort of last minute change to the agenda today, but really appreciate everyone joining and engaging in the conversation. We'll hope to share some updates from that regional partners meeting that's taking place in our next call, and look forward to seeing you all on upcoming webinars or the next call for GFAN, which is March 8th. And as Robin had said earlier, in the chat, you will find links for the next TBHLM call. So thank you all for joining. And unusually, we're giving you about 20 minutes of your time back today. So hope you can make good use of it, maybe get some fresh air before your next call. Take good care. And thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you, and bye.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everybody.